Thanks very much for having me today. I'm delighted to be here speaking in New York, my hometown. Well, not hometown, but current residence. I'm going to be talking about story-driven development, what I would call the next generation of Rails functional testing. So just to kind of get an idea of people's familiarity with these concepts, raise your hand if you are familiar with the concept of user stories in one form or another. Okay, great. And then how many of you guys use RSpec right now? Wow, that number has gone way up. And then how many of you guys have actually played around with the RSpec story runner? A few, okay, cool. So the next generation of Rails functional testing is kind of the flashy tagline, the whiz-bang title to get the talk accepted and to get you guys to show up. But this is actually really useful stuff. I'm really excited about it. For me personally, this kind of approach has been the biggest step forward in my development practices since I started doing TDD, I would say. So who am I? No one really, no books. I don't blog enough. But I've been doing Rails for about 3 years now. Member of the New York City Ruby Brigade, NYCRB, represent. And I currently work at WePlay, and you'll see some jerseys floating around. Those are my coworkers. We're basically doing like Facebook for the youth sports vertical, yet another Rails social network, because we need a lot more of those. So raise your hand and keep it up if you have spent, on a project, you've spent a bunch of time producing a functional specifications document, and the engineers worked on it with the customer, and everybody signed off on it, and you were sure that this was the document that was going to drive the project through and get everybody what they want. Raise your hand if you've been involved with one of those documents before. Okay. Now keep your hand up if you actively use that document throughout the course of the rest of the project to build the software that it described. Okay, like 2. So there's some problems in software development. We describe ideas on paper, but without seeing software, no one's really sure what's needed. Our product owner or customer at WePlay will often say, I'll ask him, is this what you're going to need to get the business value? And he says, well, I'll be able to tell you a lot better after you build it. And if you didn't do it right, then we'll have to go work on it some more. But it's really hard for him, in all fairness, to think about these interactions and the design of this complicated software from just that perspective. Sometimes it's hard to tell when you're done with development, right? There's times when the developer, I should stay away from that. There's times when the developers think that they are done and the customer hasn't received the value that they were expecting to receive. There's also times the developer keeps going beyond the minimum requirement in order to implement a feature, and that's wasteful, right? The customer would have been happy with the feature before, but development proceeded and there's more money spent. So sometimes we code up features without Ajax, and our customer will say, oh, you know what, that's good enough. Don't bother adding the Ajax. It's more important that we get this other feature coded, and maybe we'll come back around and add some Ajax to it later. Estimation is a big problem, I think, in software development right now. The way I personally handle this, or I have handled this in the past, especially when I was consulting, is I sort of guesstimate it, and hopefully it's kind of right, but then I double that to be safe, and that's what we kind of tell the customer when we're bidding on a project. And I think pretty much everyone does the same thing, because it's really hard to say how long is it going to take to build this Rails app. Who really knows? Does the application still work as you're developing it? So you tweak a before filter in application.rb. What do you do now to make sure you haven't broken anything in the app? Nobody wants to go through and have to click through every interaction in the app to make sure that this widespread change didn't break any functionality that was previously verified. Somebody already checked to make sure it worked the first time. Do you have to recheck that every time you make a change to application RHTML, application RB, any of your base classes? And how does the system actually work, right? So there was a time during the WePlay launch where we got a request for a copy change to update some text related to media privacy settings. And it turns out that the copy change was for functionality that everyone thought that we had but never existed, which was like group private media. So that doesn't exist, and nobody knew that. Everyone kind of thought it must have been there, but no one was sure, and there's certainly no testing that was ever done to make sure that it worked. So with story-driven development, you can remove ambiguity when you're defining requirements. And you can establish a common vocabulary between the customers and the developers, which is really great for facilitating communication. With story-driven development, you can do this just in time. You can keep things relatively simple as you're going, the KISS principle, and it allows you to really connect your customers with the code that is being written. With story-driven development, you can also get a lot of confidence in your refactoring. You can build new features, fix bugs, make changes to application RB, and be relatively confident that the application still works as it was previously verified to work. You can catch those errors before the check-in. You can catch them on your continuous build, but you can catch them before they make it on their way to production. And that's if you're doing this process pretty well. One time on the WePlay project, after we started doing this process, we added stories for our activity feeds, which is kind of like the Facebook news feed. And to do that, we had to test a bunch of different areas of the application which produce news feed items. And it turned out that those activity feed stories were our best, or one of our best ways to catch regressions in a number of pieces of functionality because they ran all the time. And it was basically free after they were written. And then in order to get to the point where everyone fully understands how the application works, it's nice to have some executable documentation. Because if it's not executable, it's likely to become like the specifications document, which many of you guys have worked on. It will atrophy, it will become inaccurate over time, and it can do more harm than good. Right? Bad documentation is generally worse than no documentation because it is providing you misinformation. So what is story-driven development? It all starts with the story format. And we're going to go through this part by part. To start, you have a story title, which describes the activity of the functionality that you want to build. It's brief. It fits on an index card. That's really important for us because that's how we track the work that we're doing for the week. And it explains at some level that the customer or product owner can understand what's being asked for. So this is a fictional application to track down Rails developers for a headhunter who always needs to hire more Rails developers. You may be familiar with some of these emails. I generally trash them, but they might need an application to help them, more selectively target those emails. After your title, you've got narrative. So the format that we generally prefer for these is the as I want to so that format. It helps us identify the goal, either the user or business value, which are really actually the same thing, right? If you have value that's being provided to your users, and you have value by having users, then it's business value. And they put you in the context of thinking about who's going to use this feature, which is actually really great in order to get your customer thinking about real usage that's going to happen in the real world. And these can include like background information if necessary. So moving on to the scenarios, we like a title that describes the difference. So we don't repeat the story title in the scenario title because it's redundant. We want the words in the scenario title to be as high impact as possible so we don't overload them there. And although this example doesn't have it, putting a verb in there can be great. So an example would be like reject invalid zip codes. So you've got the case that you're handling, which is invalid zip codes, and what you want to do. You want to reject those from the system. The body of the scenario is a given, when, then list of steps. And given, when, and then is just kind of a way to describe preconditions, events, and postconditions, or like context, action, outcome, however you want to think about it. And the key with these steps is that they're approachable by stakeholders, customers, developers, testers. It's really a language that anyone can understand because it's just English, right? It's not a Ruby API per se. They're just words that people can get their heads around. So a couple examples in these stories of the given. This is just the required context that's needed for the story. So it doesn't actually say anything about the fact that there might be other information in the system, or a user might have gone through 6 other pages in order to get to this point. It doesn't really matter for the piece of functionality that we're introducing, which is being able to find CVs by experience. The when step is the action, and it's important that this describes the feature that's being produced. And then your then is your post condition. So this is like your assertions, for those of you who are used to like test unit kind of development, or your shoulds if you're used to RSpec development. So these might seem kind of familiar. User stories was originally an agile term, still is a very important agile term. And agile defines user stories as a tool for planning and analysis, and kind of a token to have a later conversation about a piece of functionality. So they don't really need that much detail. All it needs is enough detail so that when you pick it up after not looking at it for a while, you can sit down with your customer and say, oh, this is what we were thinking, does this make sense? And go from there and figure out if it needs to be worked on. Story-driven development stories are actually taking this a little bit farther. They're design up front, not big design up front, not designing your objects up front. They're fine-grained enough so you can actually work on them, and they'll give you good assurance that once you've met the scenarios that you've defined, that you're actually delivering the business value to the customer. So they're acceptance criteria. And the concept of agile stories and story-driven development stories are not mutually exclusive. We actually use both of these quite regularly, and our agile stories, as they get closer to the development phase, get turned into story-driven development stories. So it's not like you have to pick one or the other. They work very well hand in hand. It's just useful to kind of understand the distinction between the two definitions. So in order to have a good story, you want to describe a single case. And the first problem I think that happens when people try to write these down is they want to use if statements, especially customers. So they want to say, if the zip code is longer than 5 digits, then reject it. Well, okay, but what does that sound a lot like? That sounds like Ruby code, right? That sounds like the code that's going to be in the application. For tests, you don't want if statements. If you feel like you need an if statement, you probably want 2 cases. You want one where the zip code is 5 digits long and one where the zip code is 6 digits long to test the boundary condition. When you're doing a story, you want it to be declarative and unambiguous, and you want it to be decoupled from implementation. So as an example of what not to do, this is what I would call an imperative example for making sure that we don't allow duplicate developers into the CV tracking system. So it says, given I'm on the developer's page, when I click the Add Developer button, then I should see the Add Developer page. When I enter the first name Zed and I enter the last name Shaw, and I click the Create Developer button, then I should see the message Zed was created, and the developers list should contain Zed Shaw. When I click the Add Developer button, then I should see the Add Developer page. When I enter the first name Zed and I enter the last name Shaw, and I click the Create Developer button, then I should see an error. There can be only one Zed Shaw. So don't do that. This is just obviously going to be something that's like 1 line of code, and now you've written 10 lines to describe and verify it. And this is just a pain to maintain. You don't want your whole application described like this. As an alternative, I would propose this declarative example, which simply says, given there is a developer Zed Shaw, when I try to add a developer named Zed Shaw, then I should see an error. There can be only one Zed Shaw. And that actually tests the same amount of important functionality, and it's a lot easier to parse out the kind of important information, and it doesn't need to change when the small details change. That text can hold true if you add another attribute to developer, which is, desired salary range. This doesn't change at all. But in the previous example, you might be tempted to add lines for filling out those fields as you're filling out those forms the 2 times. So implementing scenarios is all about automation. This is where I really like the red button analogy. And the red button analogy is, what would you do if you could have a red button that when you pushed it told you if your application worked? How often would you push it? Who would push it? And having a suite of scenarios is like giving yourself that red button. If you develop your functionality like this, you can run a command, push a button, and get output that says, you know what, the application still works as everyone thinks it works. So we do this with the RSpec story runner, which is composed of 3 bits of varying degrees of importance. There's the plain text stories, which is what we were looking at. That's the most important part, because that's what's customer facing. There's also the step matchers, which we're going to get into in a second, which are the pieces of Ruby code that drive the plain text stories and make them executable. And then there's a runner file, which just actually connects the two so that you can run them from TextMate or from the command line. And the RSpec story runner was originally a project called RBehave by Dan North, which was based on JBehave. The RSpec guys decided that, you know what, this is a really cool piece of functionality. It very well complements the spec BDD style. So we're going to bring it into the RSpec project and make it kind of first class, which was a tremendous vote of confidence on the concept, I think, by David Chalimsky and Aslak and the guys who are maintaining the RSpec project these days. It produces really clean, natural syntax, as we've seen, and we already wrote the scenarios. So the runner file, as I said, just kind of hooks up the two. In this case, we have a story file, which is just plain text, which is myfile.story. And we have a set of step matchers, which is CVs. So that's in the cvs.rb file in the steps subdirectory. And we say, with those steps, I want to run that story. So the interesting thing here is that you could potentially run the same story with a different set of steps. It's not something that we do regularly, but you'll see an example of that when I show kind of the different ways you could implement the same story behind the scenes with the step matchers. So if you've got a given step, which says, given a CV with 3 years of Rails experience, this is an example of the code that you could write to make that run. And this is just a simple active record create statement, which sticks data right in your database. Your when step, when I search for qualified Rails candidates, could simply use a class method on developer called findQualified and pass in the number of years experience it's looking for and store it into an instance variable for checking in the then steps. And then your then step can simply look at the results instance variable and check that it should include the CV that you created in the precondition. So this is just the RSpec assertion style, and it's free to use in any of your scenarios. And then sometimes when you're doing scenarios, you have a piece of information you want to convey, but it doesn't actually have any code that needs to execute. So you can implement these by simply having an empty block, which does nothing. And I would really encourage you to not be afraid of this. It kind of feels like writing an empty method, which is something you would really never do in Ruby. It can be very helpful to convey the reasoning behind a scenario to anyone who reads it. So if somebody says that they have 8 years of Rails experience, then I should realize the candidate is full of shit. It's important to convey to the customer, but there's no code that needs to happen. And this style I refer to as direct object access. So you're just working with the Ruby objects that your app code would work with. In this way, this is actually just another way to write a spec, right? We've all been able to write code like that before, which creates something in the database and runs a query against it and then verifies that the correct results come back. That's nothing new. So it's very fast, it's very flexible, but it's not testing the full stack of your application, right? There's no models there's no views or controllers involved. There's a lot that could go wrong with your application that would make it not work in production that this test that you just wrote is not going to show you. So the Rails integration test style is what we have here. It's another way we might implement the same given step. And this basically simulates HTTP requests. It uses the Rails routing framework, and it runs assertions against HTML that comes back. So in this way, it's much more full stack. And this syntax has been around for a while. since I believe Rails 1.1. You have the HTTP method, which is get developers new. You assert against the response based on some matchers that it should have a form tag with an action that points to the developer's path, and it should have the inputs that we would expect. And then once you know that those inputs are there, you can do a post providing a parameters hash, which kind of imitates the parameters hash that a browser would produce should you present that form and someone would fill it out. But if you look at this, there's actually a lot of duplication here. And it's relatively verbose, and the syntax is pretty ugly. So if you've looked at this before and been turned off by doing functional testing like this, then I think that you should take another look, because there are alternatives that are available now. So this is the mom test. This is a form to create a new developer in that CV system that I've been describing. And what I'd like everyone to do now is kind of turn to someone who's next to them and describe how you would give instructions to your mom to fill out this form. Okay? I'll give you like 30 seconds, and I'm going to have a little bit of water. And then I'm going to call on a couple people. Okay. Everyone have enough time? All right, so who's interested in sharing? I'd like to get like 2 different responses. Raise your hand if you can tell me the discussion, the kind of steps that you described to your neighbor. Anyone? Yes?
Call Dad.
Okay, that's one way to do it. Anyone else? You guys are all very shy.
Okay. For me, it'd be very painful. Can you see the thing that says new developer? Mm-hmm. All right. Now, can you look underneath that? There's something that says first name, and there's a little box underneath it.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Can you take the mouse, click on the box?
Right.
Then type your first name.
Okay, so maybe it would be better next time to use like a friend test instead of the mom test, because apparently everyone's moms are going to need very slow instructions. But the things that you probably didn't mention when you were describing how to fill out this form are the IDs of the elements in the HTML, the field names, the name attributes on your inputs, any type of URLs and where that form might be going, and the HTTP method that's in play. You're not going to tell mom, and then you post the form to /developers, because I think that might be a little much. So there's actually a way you can describe filling out this form in a language that's very similar to how you might describe filling out this form to your friend. And this loads the developers page. It verifies that the first name field exists on the page. It verifies the last name field exists. It checks that there's a Rails experience select box with the number 4 as one of the options, that there's a radio button for mail, and it simulates filling in all that data. It verifies there's a create button on the page. It pretends to click it, and it verifies that the page that it gets after clicking it is a 200, not a 404 or a 500 or any other, or a redirect. No, actually, redirects are fine. So it's a lot like how you would describe this in plain English. And you can actually do all of your steps like this. So for your when action, you might visit the developer's path. And this is assuming that we've included a search field right on our index page. And we're going to type into that search form on the page, and we're going to click search. So that's going to verify that all of that stuff kind of works. And then for our post condition, what we're going to do is check that the response has the text gym on the page. So rather than looking at an instance variable where those results might be captured, you let the Rails request, using the views, render the output that comes back, and you make sure that the right developer shows up on the page. So this syntax is from a library which I maintain called Webrat. And Webrat is a browser simulator which basically manipulates the document object model and tries to imitate how a browser might allow a user to fill in those form fields directly. So when you say, fill in the first name with this value, it looks at the label fields on the page, finds the text first name, checks that label's for attribute to find the input that it's referencing, then it finds the name attribute of that input, and it starts building up a parameters hash to submit when you say clicks button. So this was originally written by a guy named Seth Fitzsimmons when he worked with me at East Media here in New York. And it's, I think, a really great way to describe functionality in your step matchers. Webrat basically is full stack. I would say almost full stack because there's no real browser involved. You're not going to get any coverage of your JavaScript, but you get coverage of your routes, that those work, your controllers, your views, your models. You can be pretty sure that if you deploy this application, people are going to be able to use it. So in that way, it gets you high coverage and high confidence, and it's pretty fast still because you don't have to fire up a browser. Now, when we actually implement these on our projects, I would recommend that you combine this approach with direct object access. So frequently, we will use direct object access to create objects in the database in our preconditions, and then we will use Webrat steps for our whens and our assertions and our then steps to make sure that that piece of functionality works correctly. But it's faster to just use kind of factory methods in our givens to pre-populate the database. And that's not really, for a given scenario, the part you're testing. You're testing the action. So presumably, whatever you're creating in the given, there's another scenario somewhere else which tests the interaction for creating one via Webrat. As an alternative to go even farther than Webrat, you could always go to Selenium. And Selenium is great because it's totally full stack, right? Selenium can't do anything that a user couldn't do by opening your page up in a browser. So in that way, it's very reassuring. There's also Water, and this is really the only way to test JavaScript functionality in your application today. But it's kind of slow, and the browser dependency makes it a bit difficult to run regularly and integrate into the rest of your systems. But it does test the full stack, and it has the added advantage that you can watch it run, which can be great to kind of demonstrate functionality to your customer if they're very visual. It's a lot easier to get them to look at pretty pictures moving about than actually reading text. They love shiny metal objects. So what is the relationship between scenarios and unit tests? We're all writing unit tests. Why do we need these other tests? There's a great quote by Uncle Bob Martin where he explained that unit tests make sure you write the code correctly, and scenarios make sure you write the correct code. So that's kind of a great way to think about when you should be writing a scenario is whenever you want to make sure that you're writing the right code, you're writing the code that your customer needs. And these are all related. So in terms of the different types of tests, you've got unit tests, integration tests, full stack scenarios, and in-browser scenarios. And as you move from the bottom up, your tests go from faster to slower, your different types of tests, but they also go from integrated to isolated. So there's a lot of value in having those isolated tests because you can run them with auto test and they can give you back information in like 3 seconds, but they're not testing as much. So if you're concerned about speed with running your scenarios, and you can build up a suite of scenarios which takes a couple minutes to run. I believe our suite at WePlay is like probably approaching 250 scenarios, and it takes about 2 minutes. That's all with Webrat, no Selenium, and a minimal amount of direct object access except in our givens. But it takes a couple minutes. So what we do is we run just the stories that we're working on as we're going and programming all day. And then when we're going to commit or verify the whole application works again, we run the full set of stories with Rake. And of course, our continuous build is set up to run them every time. So we've got a insurance policy. And if you run into any problem with your scenarios being slow, you can, of course, just kind of benchmark and optimize to see where you might be able to cut some corners and get some big speed gains. So I kind of think of the ecosystem of web application testing like the food pyramid. So just like the Department of Agriculture can teach you which sort of food you should be eating by this helpful chart, I can provide my opinion on how you might want to do your overall web application testing picture. So at the bottom, you've got your unit tests, and you want to have lots and lots and lots of these, and they run very quickly. In the middle, you want your executable scenarios, which are going to be a lot of value. Those are like RSpec stories with Webrat, and you're going to want lots of those as well. And then the selenium and water tests are kind of like your fats, oils, and sweets. You want to use them sparingly. So if your application doesn't have much JavaScript, you might even be able to get away without those entirely. And currently at WePlay, we're doing that. We write all of our JavaScript to be kind of progressive enhancement. And so far, it's been better for us to just use Webrat to test the same functionality and not worry about the JavaScript because it hasn't caused us a lot of pain. But you do need the whole pyramid, at least from the middle part down, to have good confidence that your application still works. So when you're talking about Agile with story-driven development, these things kind of go together like peas and carrots. You work with your customer on your scenarios. Sometimes it can be great to even sit down at the same computer and pair with them on them. And you can create them at the start or during an iteration, like a week of work. And if you have the problem where you don't have an involved customer, which I think is way more developers than it should be, then at least it can be helpful to write these kind of on your own and present them to the customer and say, hey, here's what I was thinking for how this system should behave. Does this make sense? And at that point, they'll say, oh, yeah, that looks like that makes sense. Well, then you tell them later, I actually know that it works like this because I can run these against the application, and this right here shows me that it behaves like that. And they get really excited about that. You can define new scenarios for discovered requirements. So as you're doing implementation, you will come across edge cases, and you can just write a new scenario for it to make sure that everyone understands how it should behave and that it behaves like that. Or if your QA process uncovers bugs or cases that you didn't consider, then that's a good time to add a new scenario. You can verify your progress in terms of scenarios and stories. That doesn't mean you don't do exploratory testing, but these can be great guideposts to make sure that the code is ready to ship. And the process for doing this for a given scenario starts by writing the scenario, which will actually in RSpec give you a pending or yellow scenario. Once you write the step matchers, it will be able to execute the scenario, but you won't have the app code to make it work, so it will go red. Then you write the code to make it work, to get the scenario green, and then you can often refactor. So this is like the red-green refactor cycle that we're all used to from TDD, but at a higher level. And you might go back and forth between writing the code and writing the step. Sometimes it's easier to write some of the step matchers after you have an idea of the HTML structure of the page. So we'll alternate a little bit between the two. So I've got a brief demo, if the demo gods are nice to me today, where I just want to show kind of how this cycle looks in real life. OK, so I'm going to be in text mate, so give me a sec. How do I hide the drawer here? OK, so the story file is the same file that we've seen throughout the presentation. And then we have a runner file, which is going to be the same file name, but just with an RB extension. So when we run this, you can see the output in the case where we have success. So both of these scenarios executed and RSpec didn't find any problems. If we go to the case where we test this with the user interface, which actually has step matchers that are checking against the page, this is currently the not implemented state. So it's going to the index page, and it can't find the input Rails experience because there's no search forms. This is after you've written the step matchers, but before you've implemented the functionality. And when you get that output, you see that it says it couldn't find the input Rails experience. Sometimes it's useful to kind of take a look at the page as it exists in that state. So there's a Webrat feature called Save an Open Page, which lets you actually take the HTML response. I didn't say that there. Take the HTML response and pop it open in a browser so that you can see the output. Oh, so the reason it wasn't working here is this, if it fails in the when step, it doesn't get to the thens. So it hits the first part where it fails, and then it stops executing subsequent steps. So in this part, after I visited the developer's index page, I open it up in Safari, and I can take a look and say, oh, you know what, that's not implemented. So if I switch over to the situation where the functionality is implemented, then the same scenario passes. Now I've lost Keynote. So inside an iteration, what does this look like? At the start, you're going to have just pending scenarios. You're not going to have any of your steps actually implemented. You're not going to have any of your functionality implemented. So that's kind of what the yellow bar represents. As you progress, you're going to write more pending scenarios. You're going to make more of them pass. Eventually, at the end of your iteration, ideally, everything's green. So there might occasionally be some reds thrown in here, which is a regression. It's something that worked previously, and then it broke. But hopefully, you don't even check those in. So this is what it looks like on the build server. To get started with this, what you want to do is write new scenarios for new functionality being developed. And then what we try to do is write scenarios for everything that breaks. So pretty soon you'll have scenarios for everything that matters if you've got coverage on things that break and things that are new. There are a couple of things that can go wrong when you're running your scenarios, though, right? You can have two cases. One is that the application breaks, someone reports a bug, but the scenarios still pass. And if that happens, what you want to do is write a scenario to catch it and then make it pass. So just like we said before, we expand the coverage. But there's also this other case you can get into with scenarios where the scenarios start failing, but the application still works. And this might happen if you change like the copy on a flash message, and you're hooking and you're asserting against that copy. If your editor changes it, then everyone feels like the app still works just fine, but your scenarios fail. You might want to reduce the specificity of your scenarios so that that failure is not likely to occur again in the future, so you don't have to deal with it. So the way I define story-driven development is before code is written, the team produces executable scenarios for a user story. The important word in here is team, which is product and engineering, because this is a product owner-facing process. It's outside in. And the way I think about it is behavior-driven development is to test-driven development, as story-driven development is to acceptance test-driven planning. And they share a lot of things in common, but it can be valuable to kind of think about things with a different vocabulary and a different perspective, which guides you towards a better implementation. It's not to say that this is, like, acceptance test-driven planning is a bad idea. So if you're interested in this, there are a number of resources you can check out online and in dead tree form. The RSpec website's a good place to get instructions on how to install this stuff. David Chelimsky is the lead maintainer of RSpec. He writes about these topics occasionally. Dan North's blog post, What's in a Story, is pretty good for a lot of the ideas behind what makes a good story and what makes good scenarios. Webrat is on GitHub. My blog is brianairy.com, and I'm making a pledge to write about these topics more because I'm a slacker. And then there's User Stories Applied, which is a book by Mike Cohn, where he talks about some concepts in terms of like collaborating with your customer on user stories, and I think it's pretty valuable. So thanks. That's the end of the lecture part of the presentation. I'm really interested in engaging some questions. I think we got mics that we can run around. So raise your hand if you've got any questions, and we'll try to answer as many as I have time for. 0 questions? OK.
Is this something that anyone, like unit testing, a whole bunch of things that are good for you, but people don't do, like it'd be good for anyone wanting to gym.
Right.
It'd be good for people if everyone does unit testing, but they don't. Where does this fit?
So the question, I think, is there are a lot of things that might be good to do as a developer, but you might not. Where does this fit in that kind of scale? Like,
in terms of barrier to entry, like it's hard to get people to keep documentation up to date.
Right.
Getting people to contribute to it, which is easier.
Right. So I think that RSpec user stories actually have a lot of advantages in terms of being easy to get started with, because you already need to define functionality in a way that the customer and the developer can understand. So you're not like investing entirely into something that you're not doing already. You can leverage some of that investment that you already make and turn it into a more effective way to spend that time. And then once you've realized, like once the customers realize that these things now run, there's a lot of value in keeping them running, so it kind of just perpetuates itself, the process.
There's a lot of RSpec storage tools that are used for documentation. You can export them to HTML.
Right. Well, so it starts with plain text, which is readable enough on its own. But if you want to translate those out to textile or HTML, any kind of, I mean, even Word, if you wanted to, you could do that to engage your customers even more. Other questions?
Could you repeat Francis's question?
Francis. It was more of a statement. Francis said that there's just a lot of ways that you can take this format and turn it into other sorts of output. Other questions? Hands? Yeah.
I'm interested in the one of the last slides that you showed about what happens when your scenarios fail and your application works, or what happens when your application works and your scenarios fail.
Right.
And you mentioned the concept of reducing the specificity of your stories in order to make sure that those things happen. Can you delve a little bit further into how you find that balance between specificity and appropriate coverage?
Sure. So the question is, how do you find a good balance between being very specific in your scenarios and ensuring that they're not going to give you false positives in terms of showing you that something broke, but it's really fine. And it's all a matter of degree. And I think it varies a lot on a case-by-case basis depending on what you're building. But usually when we're a pair approaching writing step matchers for a scenario, we try to think kind of about what the likely axis of change is for a given piece of functionality. So if we think that a piece of text on the page is likely to change, then we will go out of our way to avoid anchoring an assertion to it. We might take actually a substring of that and say, you know, if it says this word and this word next to each other, it's probably part of the right page. And that gives us the flexibility to change the functionality without having to worry about it as much. So it's very much case-by-case basis. The good thing is if you go too far, it'll tell you, and then it's usually relatively straightforward to kind of correct, and you'll get a feel for it very quickly, I think. Ben?
Curious about this mythical business analyst that's willing to pair with programmers. And if you're finding them customers willing to do this, and if customers are not, do you find value in writing stories yourself as a programmer, or is it easier just to skip all of the verbosity and jump right to the specs themselves?
Right. So at WePlay, we're pretty fortunate because we work in the same room with all of our customers, our product owners. So I don't ever really use the word pairing too much around them, but it's pretty easy to call them over and show them things or ask them to sit next to you when you play with stuff on the computer, and they don't even really realize as involved as they are in it. So if you don't have that luxury, which is really a luxury, I think, these days in the real world of development, I do think it's incredibly valuable anyway. And it also makes it a lot easier to try to engage the customer even more when they realize that this entry point is available to them. So when I worked at East Media, one of our product owners I was showing him this stuff, and he got really excited just after seeing some examples, because he said, now I can finally get the developers to write the code that I want. And it was right. Like, it's a way to make sure that you're getting the value that you want. So it helps with the engagement, but if you can't get the engagement up front, it's been incredibly helpful just from the regression standpoint. The number of bugs that we've caught with these things before they make it up to our production servers is huge, which is dangerous because you might get into the feeling that, like, if the scenario is passed, then there's no reason to test anything else. But it's worth it for the failures that you get. And there's a lot of times we'll look at something, we'll be like, oh, this scenario is not working. I wonder how we wrote it wrong. And then after staring at that for 5 minutes, we go back to the scenario and we're like, wait a minute, the app is broken. Like, it's not supposed to work like that, or it's a new bug or a regression that we introduced, which is kind of a cool feeling, right? When you think that it's a bug in your test, but actually it's a bug in your code that your tests were showing you, you feel kind of good about your tests. Yes?
When you're writing stories, do you find there's a tendency to focus more on the functionality of the application, more so than the global properties, such as security, performance, reliability? So do you write stories for those properties as well?
Right. So the question is, when you're writing stories, it seems to focus on the functionality application rather than some of the other concerns that might be important, like security and performance. And how do you balance those, or do you address those in stories? Is that right? Okay. So for security, we do not write scenarios specifically for testing like security conditions, but we do write specs for them. So that's the way we've handled it. If if I'm writing a piece of functionality for a bank where one of the product owners coming to me and saying this must be absolutely secure and it has to handle this condition like this, and it has to alert somebody if this suspicious thing happens, then I think it makes total sense to write scenarios for that because the product owner is asking for it. Our product owner doesn't need to be worried about security too much. We worry about that. So they just have this kind of expectation that everything we write is relatively secure, and we try to handle that with specs. In terms of performance, it's kind of it's tricky to test performance, right, in specs. So we've started playing with some ways to leverage our scenarios to make sure that our performance of the app stays in the place that we want it. But it's pretty difficult to just write tests like that. So just kind of out of necessity, it's not too much of an option. I'm interested to see what people can come up with there. But generally, the rule of thumb is if the product owner asks for it, it should probably go in a scenario, and if the product owner doesn't care, then we probably just write specs for it. Yes?
I've seen RSpec used to great effect in some open source projects like Rubinius. But for user stories, it seems like they're really focused around a customer, and in a big open source project, there is no customer you can go to. So do you think user stories have a place in open source?
I do, but I think it depends a lot on the project. So Webrat itself is fully tested, but there are no stories. It just doesn't really make sense to approach a library from a language that's oriented towards your customer or non-technical people. It's actually more bang for your buck to just have a spec suite. So for libraries, I don't think it necessarily makes too much sense to have scenarios. I know the RSpec guys have played around with writing scenarios to cover parts of RSpec, and I'm not sure how they found that. It would be interesting to get their perspective, but it seems like if it's not, if it's entirely developer level kind of tools that you're worrying about, then scenarios aren't the most effective way to describe it. But if you're describing like an open source web app, like WordPress, then it might be valuable, depending on who's driving the functionality. Anything else?
Brian,
That's it?
One more.
One more? Yeah.
So you mentioned that it was difficult to test JavaScript, or the only way to test it was with Selenium.
Right.
For you guys, and I wondered if you actually tried or evaluated JS unit and found it inappropriate or lacking.
So the question is the trouble with testing JavaScript, and have we looked at JS unit? We haven't tried it on the project. From my understanding of JS unit, it's basically like unit level tests for your JavaScript code and objects. So I think that it kind of fills a role that specs fill for Ruby code, and that having the full stack kind of test for the AJAX interactions is would still be potentially valuable on its own. So I don't think it's like a JS unit instead of Selenium. I think that they kind of go together like specs and RSpec stories. I think I'm out of time.
Yeah.
So thank you guys. I will be around, so please grab me.